Good morning and welcome to this virtual colloquium hosted by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Bijan Ahmadi and I'm the Executive Director of IPD. It is my privilege to open today's event titled Canada in a Shifting International Order, Debating Our National Interests. Before diving into today's program, I would like to take a moment to remember someone who was a pillar in the Canadian public policy landscape, Honorable Hugh Segal. Hugh, who sadly passed away last month, was a longtime public servant, former senator, and a guiding light in the field of public policy. He devoted his life to crafting solutions above partisan lines. He contributed to many different organizations, and we were privileged at IPD to have him as an advisor for our project on Canada's national interests, which this event today is a part of. Hugh's absence will be deeply felt, but his influence, his work, and his contributions will continue to inform the manner in which we approach policy challenges. May he rest in peace. Now, before we start today's program, please allow me to briefly introduce the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We are a nonprofit and nonpartisan international affairs think tank operating in both Canada and the United States. Here in Canada, our mission is defined by three core objectives: to equip our decision makers with strategic insights, analysis, and policy recommendations grounded in evidence-based research and prudent realism, to facilitate knowledge exchange between Canadian and international scholars and policy researchers, and to identify, educate, and nurture the next generation of Canadian policy leaders who will help our country strengthen its position and advance its interests on the international stage. Today's event is part of IPD's year-long project titled Canada's Interests in a Shifting Order. This initiative has convened leading policy experts in a series of roundtables to rethink the central tenets of Canada's national interests in a changing world. As we all recognize, the international order is undergoing seismic shifts. New power centers are emerging, long-standing alliances are fraying, new partnerships are forming, and the institutions that have long supported the global order are under unprecedented strain. Meanwhile, humanity grapples with existential challenges like climate change that respect no borders. In this complex landscape, Canada finds itself at a strategic crossroads as the traditional pillar of our post-war foreign policy. Reliance on a rules-based international system defined by liberal principles appears increasingly unstable. With the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia initiated the largest military conflict on the European continent since the end of the Second World War. Russia's brutal invasion has not only brought death and destruction upon Ukraine and perpetrated atrocities against Ukrainian people, but it has also disrupted the global economy and impoverished millions worldwide, particularly in the global south. In line with our NATO allies and partners, Canada has provided substantial support to Ukraine and has committed to maintaining this support for as long as needed. However, as the Ukrainian counteroffensive has moved more slowly than many anticipated and the stalemate endures, it remains unclear how Canada, the United States, and their allies plan to either assist Ukraine in breaking this deadlock or find a pathway toward a negotiated settlement. Additionally, the conflict has heightened concerns among Canadian decision makers about Russia's military buildup in the Arctic, exposing significant gaps in our defensive capabilities and infrastructure in the north. Amid various domestic and international priorities, it is yet unclear whether we will allocate the necessary national attention and resources to develop and defend this critical geostrategic region. In the Indo-Pacific, a more assertive People's Republic of China is raising concerns not only among its neighbors in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, but also in the United States, which now views China as a strategic peer competitor, threatening the stability and survival of the US-led order in East Asia and beyond. China's behavior, coupled with the escalating US-China rivalry, has created additional uncertainties about the stability of the Indo-Pacific region. This has led many countries, including Canada, to rethink their approach to China and to diversify their relationships within the Indo-Pacific. Today's sessions aim to dissect these complex global issues and examine their implications for how Canada defines and prioritizes its national interests in the 21st century. Our first session, a conversation with Professor Janice Stein, will delve into the implications of great power competition on international institutions and what this means for Canada. This will be followed by a speech by Parliamentary Secretary Rob Oliphant, and then an expert discussion on Canada's interest in the era of great power competition. Our second session will focus on multipolarity and multilateralism, examining Canada's potential contributions to a more balanced global order. Experts and esteemed former diplomats will share their perspective with us during this session. Our third session, in the third session that we're going to have later this afternoon, MP Garnet Janice will present a conservative viewpoint on Canada's national interest, which will set the stage for a subsequent discussion on the role of value promotion in a world that is in a state of flux. For those interested in delving deeper, I encourage you to visit IPD's website to learn more about IPD's project on Canada's national interest and review the series of publications generated to date by the project core members and the participating experts. In addition, starting today, through a collaboration with the Policy Options magazine, we're publishing a series of articles by experts who have participated in this project to reflect on their views about the nature and scope of Canada's national interests in a multipolar world. I extend my appreciation and my gratitude to Zachary Paikin, Anne Fitzgerald, and Walter Kemp, who have spearheaded this project for IPD. I would also like to thank all the speakers who have accepted our invitation to join us today. Your engagement fuels meaningful dialogue, and I hope these discussions move us at least a step closer to the well-informed policy decisions our nation so urgently needs. The first discussion will be led by my colleague, Zachary Paikin. Zach is here with us now. Zach, thanks for your efforts for this project. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bijan. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Ça me fait très grand plaisir de vous accueillir ce matin sur notre plateforme. My name is Zachary Paikin. I am a non-resident research fellow with IPD and have been proud to direct the project on Canada's interests in a shifting order over the past year. Over this past year, we have been bringing together, as Bijan just said, diplomats, scholars, policy experts, former practitioners, and others to discuss the various ways in which the nature and the scope of our national interests are changing in an increasingly multipolar world, a world in which the Western Alliance appears no longer to be the only term setter of consequence. So we'll be publishing a white paper outlining the findings of our monthly roundtables that we've been holding over the past year later this fall. But in the meantime, as Bijan just mentioned, IPD is proud to announce that it is partnering with IRPP, and Policy Options this week to publish a series of short articles on the question of how our conception of the national interest is evolving and must evolve. The link to the first article that was published just this morning by Ambassador Louise Blais, our former ambassador to the United Nations, and she'll be joining our colloquium later today. That will be shared with all of you in the chat box here on Zoom. But in the meantime, it is my great pleasure to kick off today's colloquium with a keynote session and to welcome to our platform for the first time someone whom I've had the privilege of knowing for quite some time already. Janice Stein, you are the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and the founding director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Janice, welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy.
A pleasure to be with you, Zach.
Thanks so much. So Janice, most observers would agree that we are living through a moment of change or transition in the international order today. I wanted to know, in your view, how much is the return of great power competition responsible for this change?
I think the return of great power competition is what we focus on. It's visible. It's the tip of the iceberg. And certainly it is restructuring relationships. In the introduction that Bijan led, he talked about much of that. It's obvious that Russia's invasion of Ukraine restructured relationships in Europe. A newly assertive China is realigning interests across the Indo-Pacific. I think it is not the only factor, though, that is restructuring relationship. And let me just put two provocative ones, deliberately provocative ones, on the table to kick off some outraged responses during the rest of the day. The first of these is the decline of the liberal, and I'm going to stop over that word, liberal, rules-based international order. we make, I think, a category mistake when we talk about the rules-based international order and equate it automatically with a liberal rules-based international order. They're not the same thing. And so any analysis of Canada's interests and values has to make that distinction. Now, why do I make it? For this reason. If you watched the BRICS summit 10 days ago, there is an explicit rejection of liberal values. It is not a rejection of a rules-based international order. It is a rejection of a liberal rules-based international order. So we have a values conflict which goes beyond great power competition. That was Brazil. That was President Lula, right? That is the president of South Africa, who says, we want a rules-based international order, but we want it to reflect a much wider range of values. And what brings those BRICS countries together? They almost nothing, frankly. They are riven with conflict, but they agree on one thing. They are united in their opposition to a unipolar, liberal international order led by the United States. Now, that's not only a function of great power competition, frankly, and it's very hard. It's a very hard message for Canadians to hear, because as a country and in a nonpartisan way, we are deeply committed to liberal values. That is how we define ourselves. But I think this is a moment of reflection for Canadians. Our values are not attractive or persuasive to a majority of the world. That is the moment that we're living in, and it's defining for Canadians.
Well, thank you very much, Janice. And indeed, those views are not so provocative, at least at IPD, but they may, as you say, be somewhat provocative in the Canadian context. And you talked to, indeed. So you talked about the B, you talked about the S. There's also the I, which fall into the democratic camp, as it were, of the BRICS. But there's also the R and the C. And Russia and China are often lumped together in Western discourse as authoritarian challengers to the established order, whether it's the rules-based order or the liberal order. But others would adopt perhaps a more nuanced view and say that China is maybe less revisionist than Russia. Beijing continues to support many elements of the current international order, whether it's trade, multilateralism. So what's your take in particular? Can we lump these countries together? And what are the policy implications for the West of your answer?
Okay, Zach, let's go back to that distinction between liberal rules-based international order and rules-based international order. I think there is a distinction between Russia and China. Russia has challenged the rules-based international order because, the minimum common denominators, a few minimum common denominators in rules-based international order. One is don't kill my diplomats. That's been there for 400 years. It is a fundamental rule, starts with the Westphalian system. Do not kill my diplomats. They have immunity no matter what they say. But in the last 75 years, certainly it is do not use force unilaterally to change territorial borders. That's not a liberal value. That's part of the rules-based international order. And Russia violated that. So I think in that sense, Russia is a challenger to both concepts, to both conceptions of international order. China, thus far, has not done that. It is a deep challenger to the liberal rules-based international order. It has been, this is not new. It's anybody paying attention, certainly would see this as part of Chinese conversation for the last 2 or 3 decades. And Xi Jinping has given stronger emphasis. He has repeatedly talked about his rejection of American hegemony, repeatedly talked about his rejection of a unilateral order. But he is in favor, so he says, of a rules-based international order. He supports territorial sovereignty and independence. He has been, frankly, lukewarm. He has not endorsed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. in part because it goes against fundamental principles of Chinese foreign policy. What he has done, though, is extend support because he sees Russia as a key partner in challenging the American-led liberal rules-based international order. So as we go through the day today, let's distinguish between those two conceptions of order. They are so different, and they have enormous implications for Canada.
So you've mentioned, Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, of course, the United States has perhaps on more than one occasion acted outside the bounds of the UN Charter. So is the United States a revisionist power vis-a-vis the rules-based international order?
It's in fact, in some sense, U.S. behavior. It's very interesting when you read the statements that world leaders make, and even the G20, which just concluded in New Delhi. There is a lot of discussion of what is called the double standard, right? That is the United States in Iraq in 2003, then in Afghanistan, although Afghanistan is an entirely different case because the United States was in fact attacked, and one can argue, as I do, that was a legitimate defensive response under the UN Charter. But nevertheless, for many outside the liberal family, let me put it to you that way, there is a record of the United States behaving when it feels its fundamental national interests are at stake in ways that don't respect the liberal rules-based international order. And so that those words, double standard, code word, frankly, for many who in private conversation will talk about American hypocrisy, that there is a double standard, and that we are holding others to a standard that we do not, in fact, meet ourselves. And that's no small part of the fuel that is powering a lot of the discussion that we're hearing now.
So putting the actual American behavior aside for a second and just focusing on its status as the incumbent hegemon, as the most powerful country in the world, how much does the current international order depend on what we hear all the time, U.S. leadership, U.S. hegemony, and is it possible actually to envisage a stable but less hegemonic and more multipolar order?
Look, we've had multiple orders over the last. Of course, it's possible to envisage, right? If we go back to the post-Napoleonic Wars from 1815 on, the last 200 years, look at the orders we've had. We've had a concert of Europe that was very orderly until it broke down, but it lasted a very long time. After the war, we in fact had a U.S.-led and created order, all in multilateral institutions, which are now on life support, frankly, were created by a U.S. hegemon, but it was done in a period in which there was fierce great power competition with the then Soviet Union. Generally speaking, international orders need great powers who are going to contribute what we call public goods, who are going to pay some of the costs of building institutions because they believe that it's overwhelmingly in their interest to do so. And first Great Britain and then the United States built a trading system, an open trading order, which was liberal in its inspiration, because they believed they would benefit, and they did enormously, from an open trading economy. Now, if we look at the position of the United States today in 2023, I've long argued that this is going to be the American century. It is not going to be the Chinese century for a whole variety of reasons. But the scope of U.S. hegemony is significantly less for good, healthy reasons, because other countries are doing, relatively speaking, much better. China has lifted 500 million, 750 million people out of poverty. India is now on a path of ascendancy. So if you look at let's talk numbers for 1 minute, Zach. The G7, which you can effectively brand liberal, I think, with a little bit of license here, its share of global GDP is 30%. the BRICS, which by no stretch of the imagination, it includes Russia, it includes China, but it includes other countries just admitted who are really bitter opponents of liberal, or that's 37% of the world's GDP. So to be blunt, we are a minority now, we liberals in the world. And that is something that we have to deal with. We have to deal with that because we have to understand that when we leave home and say to the rest of the world, if you were only enlightened, you would be more like us. And if you're not more like us now, wait, you'll grow up and you will get it and you will be more like us when you grow up, because it is the only way. We are the universal way. When they hear that, we are actually provoking a reaction against that kind of language, as tough, as painful as that is for liberals who passionately believe in our values. We're a minority.
Well, that's an excellent segue into the G20 summit that just happened in India that you just mentioned. For the past 18 months, the West has seemingly adopted a strongly uncompromising approach, I suppose we could say, towards the war in Ukraine, but seems to have climbed down now somewhat in the face of opposition from the global South in order to agree on a final summit communique for the G20. For example, references to Russian aggression are now gone from that document. So are we going to see a lot more of that in the world order of tomorrow?
So I don't think they've climbed down. I don't think that's the right description. And if you look again at the position of the G7, there's no diminution of support. We're all, of course, focused on the US presidential election, which could be a game changer on that, as on almost every other issue that we're talking about. But aside from that, there's no diminution of support among the G7. If you look at the position, you look at the G20, there was always hedging. There was always hedging because for many of those countries, China and or Russia have been important partners in one way or the other. So if you're the US president and you're trying to consolidate a relationship with Prime Minister Modi, and you're trying to strengthen relationships with important countries in the Indo-Pacific, you make trade-offs. And you're trying to move the climate change agenda, which, if we actually want to talk about it, Zach, is the existential cataclysmic risk, which far outpaces great power competition. So presidents have to make trade-offs about what they're going to prioritize. So yes, in order not to prevent a communique from being issued at all, the Biden team accepted this kind of watered down language. But I think it's important to understand why, and then to ask ourselves as Canadians, do we have more than one goal? Of course, we remain unequivocally committed to the support of Ukraine, but is that our only goal? Or do we have other goals in the world? And are we therefore going to have to, in different fora, make different kinds of compromises? They don't feel good, but countries are not about feeling good.
That's very useful. Thank you very much. Let's delve a little bit deeper into this at the conceptual level for a second before moving on to the Canadian aspect of our discussion. Because in recent decades, we've gotten accustomed in the world to thick institutions, thick norms in global politics, right? So peacekeeping missions have become more robust. The responsibility to protect doctrine was supposed to enhance the enforceability of human rights norms. Rules are more rigid and standards are more complex than they were, for example, in the 19th century and the 20th century. But now that we've gotten accustomed to this thick order, is a thinner order fit for a more pluralistic world viable as a remedy to today's challenges, be they the crisis of multilateralism, great power conflict, et cetera?
You know, let me start the answer to this question, Zach, with a story. The responsibility to protect doctrine, which was Canadian made, Canadian innovated, published its report on the morning of September the 11th, 2001. So it is appropriate that you mention it today because it's the anniversary. It died after living for an hour, because within an hour of its publication, the World Trade Center was attacked, and all of that became history when the United States changed in its approach to the world. And the notion that sovereignty would not be respected if countries were violating human rights was no longer a priority for the United States. And so that thick order that you're talking about died 20 years ago. We just didn't have a funeral for it, frankly. But what is true, and again, let's separate the institutions here, okay? The World Trade Organization is a liberal international institution. It is committed to openness and free trade. It is on life support because the United States has disabled its appeals process. The United States, not Russia, not China, just so that we all understand this again. All right. And I could go down the list of dysfunctional. There's no more dysfunctional organization than UN Security Council, much beloved by Canadians. And you might say to me, well, we tried to get elected twice and we failed. Good. Because why would a medium-sized country like ours contribute its time, effort, and resources to a failing and paralyzed institution? It's frankly beyond me why we would do it. So the thinning down of norms and international institutions has been a fact of life for 2.5 decades, but it hasn't infused our diplomats and those who are responsible for the policy statements. And so we have again, and by the way, this is non-partisan. There was a policy convention a few days ago, one of our big parties. You wouldn't know that international institutions had thinned down. They weren't the focus of very much attention, but neither of our big parties has come to grips with a world that is fundamentally different. We engage in reflexive, comfortable repetition of what we, as people who value human rights and value freedom, I often think our foreign policy discussions are conversations with ourselves rather than with the world.
So what you just mentioned about Canada and the United Nations there, maybe that qualifies as provocative. So let's dig a little bit deeper on that and talk about Canada and the so-called rules-based international order. Because it's often asserted, not least by our current Deputy Prime Minister, that Canada relies heavily on the existence of a rules-based international order for its security and its prosperity. And presumably that means that Canada should play a role in upholding the norms and institutions of that order. So how true is it, in your view, that Canada relies on a rules-based international order for its security and its prosperity?
Which version?
Right. But let me pose it this way. How much of a core national interest is it for Canada to be upholding multilateralism in the pantheon of our interests?
Okay, I'm going to come back again. You can't take the academic out of me, no matter what. I'm going to come back to 3 words that you used in that question. They're all different. Okay. How much do we depend on the liberal rules-based international order for our economy? A great deal, because an open, free trading system is absolutely crucial to a small country or medium-sized country, depending on what you want, how you want to describe us. We are traders. Without open trade, the Canadian economy will not thrive. Now, I say this, even as there has been nobody more passionate about defending supply management for our dairy industry in the world than the Canadians have. Often, again, this is a kind of reflexive response on our part, which politics goes a long way to explain. Do we depend on a liberal rules-based order for our security? No. We depend on a rules-based order for our security. but we have to determine, and that's where I hope the hard work will come, which rules really matter to us for our security. A rule that says no unilateral use of force to change borders, that is not a liberal rule. Although, of course, liberals uphold it, but it's not liberal in origin. And the Chinese government routinely talks about it. So if we're thinking about our security over the next 30 years, which rules are we going to invest in? Finally, multilateralism, beloved of Canadians, beloved, is a tool. It's not a goal. It's a way of engaging in diplomatic practice in the world, and why we as Canadians have enshrined a tool as the single meme of our engagement with the world has always been beyond me. Sometimes big multilateral institutions are our best road. But if we're actually looking at trade, for example, right now, we have a so-called liberal hegemon who's paralyzed it. Where are the opportunities for Canada to grow its trade? They're in regional organizations. They're in some of the new ones that the United States has stood up, like IPEF. So again, let's focus on the goal. Let's focus on what matters to us. And then let's use our resources, which are not unlimited. No countries are, but ours certainly are not, in the fora where we can best advance the goal that we're trying to achieve.
Thanks very much. It's very useful again. And it sounds to me like multilateralism is more of an identity for Canada than it is an interest per se. So perhaps it's not a mistake, after all, that we're feeling this sense of national malaise today, in part because of the crisis of multilateralism. Would you agree?
Well, I think the mistake was making multilateralism our identity. As I said, very few countries in the world make a means rather than a goal their identity. But I think it's time for Canadians to shift away from talking about the way we do business to what are our core interests, what are our core values, how much do can we have a values-based discussion with our liberal friends about how we can better uphold human rights in our own countries, and how we can deepen our collaboration among what we would call the liberal like-minded. But when we move outside a circle, which in fact is not growing to be charitable and has not grown over the last 2 decades, when we move out of that circle, can we have a discussion about which rules matter for security, for the environment, and for other issues that Canadians really care about, but which will not be infused with a liberal values-based discussion. And sadly, I'm sad about it. We had a few decades, really the 80s and the 90s, where it seemed that they might be, but it has not happened, and it is increasingly less likely for the foreseeable future that it will.
So in your response just now, you mentioned working with like-minded countries, and this is a phrase that we hear quite a bit, perhaps a little bit too often in our foreign policy discourse. If we are headed for a more decentered international order, is Canada, in your view, in any way disadvantaged by being too heavily dependent or perhaps ensconced within the Western bloc? And does Ottawa need to make a conscious effort to reestablish at least a modicum of working relations with China, with India, with others?
So here I'm very charitable toward any government that we may have. Look, we live next door to the United States. Go talk to Romania, Hungary, Poland about the challenges of living next door. Ukraine about the challenges of living next door to a hegemon. We're fortunate that we have a liberal hegemon most days of the week living next door to us. Even though the United States now is in a period where it is more protectionist, it is reinvesting in industrial policy, and that is creating a whole new set of challenges for us. But no country is more exposed to the United States than we are. It will always dominate our policy. It will always dominate our economy. We've struggled for decades. We have now reduced our export dependency on the United States from 80% to 70%. There's a floor here. We have integrated economies. Within that, and so we do well when the United States does well. And any Canadian who does not understand that is making what I would call a category error, frankly. Having said that, should we deepen our relationships with India, as the United States is doing, even though Modi, in comparison to his predecessors, is a much more serious violator of human rights? So there we come to the contradictions. Yes, we should, because India is a growing, important country in that part of the world. Should we, in fact, look for a way of talking to China about the rules for international security order? Yes, of course, we should. And why is that? Because if we restrict our conversation to those who share our values, to our like-minded, it's a shrinking group in the world. And we have to live we are not world makers. We're policy takers because of our size and our geography in the world in which we live. And so talking to people, and to her credit, our foreign minister says this all the time, talking to countries we disagree with is an important part of what Canada should be doing in the world. We don't paper those disagreements over. We talk about human rights, but they're not the only conversation we have with India. They're not the only conversation we have with China. And we don't refuse to engage with them because they don't agree with us.
One last question, Janice, before we run out of time, which is on establishing some form of dialogue and more stable relationship with countries like India, with countries like China. We've got an issue at home on that front, which is diaspora management. We've got a significant Sikh population in Canada at this point. We've got a significant Ukrainian population, a significant connection to Hong Kong historically. That seems to make sometimes political considerations at home more important than our diplomatic considerations abroad, irrespective of what the so-called objective analysis of what our national interests might be. How do we square that circle?
Again, let all of us who are in this conversation today, let's create some sympathy and empathy for any government that we have. Doesn't matter, conservative or liberal. And the reason this is a good problem to have. Let's start there. It's a good problem to have because we have in this country representatives of virtually every country in the world. Somebody in this country lives here, and in some cases, large numbers of Ukrainians, of Indians, of Sri Lankans, of Pakistanis, of Chinese of all kinds, from Hong Kong, from Macau, live in Canada. And I'm about to teach my first class of the semester today. In my class is everyone from the world. Now, that's a uniquely privileged and wonderful position to be in. And so let's start by celebrating our diversity, and because it's just an enormous gift in a very complicated world. Does it make the life of a foreign minister and a prime minister very difficult? Yes. It absolutely does. And that explains, I think, and I'm very charitable about this, it explains why we get some fuzzy language all the time and some equivocating language, which Canadians might wish were not there. But the other side of that coin is in a trading system where we are, in fact, looking to open it and to grow our exports not only to the United States, but to the world. Having the kind of richness that we have in this country is just a tremendous asset. So again, life is about compromises, so is foreign policy. Let's celebrate this in terms of the huge advantages it brings to the country, and be a little forgiving of our prime ministers and our foreign ministers when they go to India. Or where I don't think, by the way, just to conclude, where I don't think there's any room for less than 100% compliance is on vigorous rejection of interference in our electoral process by any country. And why is that? Because if we're going to passionately defend human rights, we start at home. And our right to vote and to speak freely is the most fundamental thing we have in our democracy. And no foreign government should be permitted to interfere with that process. And we have the tools to monitor that. And we need the political will to come down firmly against any government who attempts to interfere in our electoral processes. That is a core value for us.
Well, thank you so much, Janice. So we've been running this project now for the past year, and I have to say that your contribution to the project has been one of the most nuanced that we've had so far and one of the most useful we've had so far. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning amidst a busy teaching schedule, and we hope we'll host you again on our platform before long. Thank you to our audience for joining us today in such large numbers. We're going to go straight into our next session, which is going to be chaired by Anne Fitzgerald, who is not only a senior fellow at IPD, as well as the project co-chair of our Canada's Interest in a Shifting Order project. And she is going to, she is rather also the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo. And wonderful to see you again. And she's going to be chairing the next session.
Thank you so much, Zachary. Bonjour à tous. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir de modérer cette session and to introduce the Honorable Rob Oliphant, who is our second keynote speaker of the day. The Reverend Dr. Rob Oliphant was elected to the House of Commons in 2015 and re-elected in 2019, representing the federal riding of Don Valley West. He previously served in that position from 2008 to 2011, where he served as official opposition critic for veteran affairs and for multiculturalism. In 2019, he was appointed as Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, worked closely with numerous ministers of foreign affairs. He chaired and served as vice chair of a number of different associations and committees, including the Canada-Africa Parliamentary Association, the Canada-Pakistan Friendship Group. He served as co-chair of the House of Commons and Senate Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying, as chair of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security from 2015 to 2017, and as chair of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration between 2017 and 2019. Rob's legislative accomplishments include an act which outlaws discrimination against genetic characteristics, as well as an act he co-sponsored which creates a national dementia strategy. A graduate of U of T, University of British Columbia, and with a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Honorable, it is a privilege to have you here today and to talk about the national interests of Canada, the central theme to this great project that the IPD is leading. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and that makes me sound very old, that introduction. And I love the way it ignores the fact that I was defeated in 2011. It's very cleverly written. And I think what I would start out by saying is I've had 5 elections, I've won 4, and winning's more fun. And I also think that being in government is more fun because I get to do things like be Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that's how I join you today in that role. And I've had 4 ministers of foreign affairs that I've served with, and love them all, and they're all different, and they've given me different perspectives on the world. And I really want to thank the Institute for inviting me, but also for holding the colloquium. It gives us a chance to reflect on the changing world order or orders. And it really is a great honor to follow Professor Stein and Zach Paikin in that discussion. I think our listeners won't, and I just had about 10 minutes of listening to Janice, and I don't think there'll be a lot of light between what she said and what I said. I think that her perspectives are quite important, and I take them very much to heart. I think I just begin by saying that the everyone who's on the colloquium today will know that there are a number of global trends that are changing the landscape in which we want to advance Canada's interests internationally, as well as make a better world. Particularly the rise of authoritarianism and authoritarian powers that are flexing their muscles, and they're challenging peace and security and stability and prosperity in the world. And I think Janice was speaking about that. We start obviously with our number one foreign policy priority right now, and that's Russia's illegal invasion into the sovereign state of Ukraine. Not the only issue that's going on. I follow very closely the coups that are continuing in the Sahel, often with the support of militias funded from outside of Africa, including authoritarian powers. China's saber rattling in the Straits of Taiwan, their imposition of their so-called national security laws being extended well beyond their borders. Now, we read today, even into the United Kingdom. And China's ongoing meddling in the affairs of other countries, including attempts at foreign interference in Canada. We know of North Korea's military exercises and their outrageous rhetoric, Iran's persecution of its own people, but as well as their engagement outside their borders in Yemen and Syria and elsewhere, and I could go on. I think we all know those stories, and all of this has led to a sharpening of competition among larger powers and really increasing the possibility of direct confrontation between or among major powers. And Canada, as a middle power, would need to be both aware but also prepared for those challenges and new challenges that could emerge. And it's not far away. I would say, while I'm not an alarmist, I'm a realist. And it's quite close to home as we watch the rhetoric between our closest ally, which Janice mentioned, the United States and China. And it affects the strategic choices of every country, whether it relates to trade of everyday commodities or advanced sensitive technology. It's not far away as we reflect on Russia's aggression, which right now is focused on Ukraine, but could easily turn elsewhere. I'm often asked about Canada's support for Ukraine, and of course it's intellectual. We won't tolerate the invasion of one sovereign country by another, especially by a permanent member of the Security Council, which contravenes international law. But it's also an emotional issue for Canada. Canada is the home of the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world outside Russia, and every one of us knows and is related to or is engaged with a Ukrainian Canadian. And so it's not only intellectual about the international rules-based order, but in Canada, because we are home to diaspora, it is something that hits us in our hearts as well. But it's even more than that. That when we look at the globe and we put Russia on one side and Canada on the far side, it looks far away. If we stand on our toes and look at the globe this way, we recognize the Arctic and that we share a maritime border with Russia, a border that's changing due to climate change. And with the opening of the Northwest and Northeast passages, we recognize the vulnerability of Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic. And Russia is not as far away as we would like it to be. I just returned, actually last night, for a trip to Europe, where two key topics of discussion were advanced. First, as in the Baltic region, where the reality of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine poses an existential threat. It's visceral. Russia has violated the most fundamental principles of the multilateral order and is causing incredible human suffering in Ukraine and around the world as they continue to weaponize both world's food supply and also energy resources. It's for the Baltics and neighboring Finland and Poland, the threat level is high, and they see the cost of losing this war as catastrophic, not only for Ukraine and Ukrainians, not only for the neighboring states, but for all of Europe and the Western world. In their view, the aim of Russia is to not only annihilate Ukraine, but to destroy Europe's security architecture and bring NATO to its knees. That affects Canada. They're extremely appreciative of Canada. Everywhere I went, they talked about Canada's engagement, particularly since the invasion of Crimea, with the training of Ukrainian military and the promotion of reforms that would help advance Ukraine into NATO and the EU. Also, more laterally, with our over 2,000 troops in Latvia, with forward presence operations there. They're mindful that Canada is a partner in this, and I think Canadians should be proud of that. But they're still asking for more. And I think Canadians will need to recognize that this is not Ukraine's fight, it's our fight as well. In Paris, I had different conversations. It was particularly about the turmoil, conflict, and unconstitutional changes of government in Mali or Burkina Faso, Niger, even Chad, and more recently Gabon. External forces preying upon public interest, widespread poverty, are wreaking havoc in those countries, their neighbors, and creating the potential for widespread illegal migration and further poverty. Canada's position as a helpful non-colonial power is both respected, and we're being called upon to engage more fully as the continent continues to lead the world in growth and potential for economic prosperity. Mindful that the solutions for African problems must reside with African countries. We need to be a helper in that position. So what do we bring to this? And what are our guiding principles or our North Star as we do this? Well, I think we are more than a country that has the power to convene. We have principles of engagement that are deeply rooted in Canadian identity and the experience of how we are in the world. There are those basic principles that have already been spoken about today. The international rules-based order, I'll get to in a moment. The rule of law, a deep commitment to human rights, and working multilaterally. I would say it's not just a ways, but it is also a means for us to accomplish that. So 4 key organizing principles that we use to engage in the world. International rules-based order. We've long been on the forefront of seeking fair play and predictability in trade, international obligations, treaties, state-to-state interactions. We have, most recently, we're leading a declaration on arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations. We think that the world is better when we follow rules. And it's predictable for business, it's predictable for populations, it leads to prosperity for all. The second would be the rule of law. And we want to advance democracies, democratic institutions. We want to advance the independence of the judiciary around the world and adherence to principles of natural justice, fair and free elections, advancement of open government and transparency, all of that being to become countries of the rule of law where we can engage also then in the rules-based order. The third one would be that commitment to human rights. We have a human rights lens that we place on all our interactions. Our commitment to a feminist foreign policy, which is about women's and girls' rights around the world as a cornerstone, also to us LGBTQI rights around the world, women's reproductive rights, civil rights, freedom of assembly and expression, media freedom, civic engagement. All of these are core principles which we try to advance. At times, we need to be more modest about it than we are to make sure that we are not discounted as simply a Western loud voice, but actually engaged in making the world better. And lastly would be the concept of working multilaterally. I believe it's more than just a sentiment, but we recognize that all of that work that we do, we can't do it alone. So we join clubs and we're good at that. So we're in the G20, the G7. We're involved at the UN and its organs, critically important. The Commonwealth, La Francophonie, which bring in some different countries from those countries in South Pacific, Africa, elsewhere. The OSCE, the OECD. We're now engaged in a full-time way at the African Union and with ASEAN as a strategic partner. We can't just talk to like-mindeds, we have to talk to others. The authoritarian regimes are reaching out to all of those countries. We can't wait until people have the same values, the same ideas as we do to engage with them. We need to engage regularly and openly to make our world better. We could go on. I mean, all of those things are there. We have climate change, which is a global issue. We've got digitalization, which is changing the way we communicate. We need to build larger coalitions with emerging countries, economies, as well as populations. We need to find voices for the global South so that they can engage with some sense of equality. My mind is still in French. I just spent the last 2 days in French. We need to continue to do that. And we need to play a long game on this. We can't simply be reactive. We have to find our voice and continue to play it. Anyway, I've gone on longer probably than I should have in my opening remarks, but wanted to make sure that got a sense of what I think Canada needs to do in the world in what is often chaotic and in a world of turmoil. I think Canada's presence needs to be proactive, and it needs to be consistent. And so Canada will continue to need to have that voice around the world. The world is asking for more of Canada. That's what I get everywhere I go, and we need to step up.
Thank you very much, the Honourable Rob Oliphant, for those very insightful comments. I'd like to follow up with on a few things, and maybe start with the whole notion of these foundational principles that we're speaking about, core values and national interest, just to get an idea, bearing in mind the somewhat universal nature and timeless nature of these core values we often refer to. What, in your mind, is the distinction between, or accounts for the distinction between, values and national interest?
They're wedded. I mean, Canada is a country which is founded on peaceful engagement, of cooperation with dual linguistic background. We obviously have recognized the horrendous cost of colonialization on Indigenous Canadians. That is part of who we are. That is a reconciliation which is ongoing. We have been engaged in conflict when our values have been threatened elsewhere off our soil. We've not had that sort of conflict on our own territory for centuries. And so we've had a peace dividend or a peace benefit for a long time. But we bring, I think, a sense of a confederation to the world. And so when we look at places where there's civil conflict, we talk about the way we live in this country with relative harmony between two large linguistic groups, English and French, but also engagement in a multicultural way of honoring different traditions, so that we take that to the world. We offer that back. So if we're looking at civil conflict in Sri Lanka, we should be offering the way we can have self-determination or self-government among certain parts of that country. We could look at Cameroon and the dual languages that are in Cameroon and the conflicts that exist. Canada can offer something in a country like Cameroon. We look at issues of migration and incorporation and engagement of people of every background into new countries, particularly in Europe, and say we can show models of how this can happen peacefully. So Canadian values are rooted in our history. They're rooted in our identity. We're a constitutional monarchy, but that doesn't mean we expect other countries to be constitutional monarchies. We work with a variety of systems, and I think we hold some of those things a little bit more lightly now than we should have in the past. And I was challenged once by a president of an African country about democracy when I was, probably a little early in this job. And he said to me, well, I'm interested in the Canadian democracy. Your upper house is not elected, am I right? And your head of state is a foreign monarch who's represented by someone at that time she appointed. How is Canada really a democracy? I said, well, you have to understand how it works in Canada with our House of Commons and our Senate. You have to understand what the real role of the Governor General and the monarch is. And he said, well, you have to understand how it works in our country as well. And it was a very important learning for me to be a little more modest and to say that it's not necessarily the ways that countries develop themselves, but the outcomes for their people. Are they free? Are they prosperous? Are they happy? Are they engaged? Are they able to advance? Are their children going to do better than they did? Those kinds of outcomes are critically important. So I'm a little bit more modest maybe than some of my colleagues on touting Canada and its virtues in the world, but say we're a bumpy society. We manage a big piece of property, this huge country. We manage to try to reconcile with Indigenous Canadians. We try to manage our language differences and welcome newcomers. So we take that to the world and we say we benefit from the rules-based order. We benefit from the rule of law. We benefit from extension of human rights. So we benefit from more conversation instead of less.
Thank you so much. Can we just move down from foundational concepts to the next level and draw a bit of a link between national interest and the actual policy process at the practical level? Today it's become very easy around the world for politicians to say, we have to do this because it's in the national interest. And sometimes people actually don't know what national interest people are talking about. So can you give us some insights in that link between the articulation of national interest and the actual policy process which follows?
Well, I think Ukraine would be an example. If we look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine at several levels, it is about our interests. So at several levels, it's not theoretical. It is practical that we depend on security arrangements with our NATO partners that Russia is attempting to diminish. Ironically, they've lost Finland and Sweden as neutral partners, and they've come to the side of NATO. I find that sort of an interesting irony of this whole situation. Trying to keep Ukraine from advancing, they lose two other neighbors. We will engage military with billions of dollars of support. We will continue to support Ukraine's reform, recognizing that it was a new democracy. Canada's over 150 years old. Ukraine is only 30 years out of the Soviet Union. So we look at this and say, how do we practically help them with women's empowerment in civil society? How do we help them with education and advancement of their economic interests? We look at the world food supply and we say it is disrupted. We're coming out of COVID. We already had supply chains disrupted. Russia has stopped food, both production as well as transportation, and Canada engages in those conversations. We up our production too, and it's hard. We don't have a planned economy, so farmers are free to do what they want. We're looking at the way we can help energy resources in Europe to make less of a dependence on Russian oil and gas for Europe. We need to advance LNG. We need to advance clean energy sources and hydrogen sources. Canada is a leader in the world in those technologies. We need to advance it. And we have an interest there too. Canada is an energy country. That's who we are, and we should continue to do that. We are committed to moving away from fossil fuels, but that doesn't lessen our role as an important player in that market, including perhaps small nuclear reactors that are mobile, and we're developing those technologies. So we look at just that one example of Ukraine and say, how do we advance Canadian interests, which are economic, which are more than just theoretical, but Canadians' livelihoods are affected by that war, and so we wanted to end quickly. We also wanted to end fairly, so we'll continue to help Ukraine with its military presence, not just diplomatically, while we do that as well.
Thank you very much. Let's shift a little bit from Ukraine to the African continent, if I may. You recently played a significant leadership role in exploring Canada's national interests on the African continent and presented ideas that no doubt led to the policy priorities being articulated in Canada's nascent African engagement strategy. Could you share some insights into that link between the interests and the policy priorities?
Sure. This is ongoing. We're not finished this yet. What we've had in Canada is a well-developed, well-articulated development policy, and we have had targeted countries around Africa, which is still the home of most of the world's poorest nations. We're also developing a trade and commercial strategy, but between those is the foreign policy element, the sinew that connects them. And that has been lacking for me. I've been working in this area for about 7 years, and I have been calling upon our government to say, what are our interests in Africa? We know we have mining interests, and particularly not just gold now, but critical minerals or rare earth minerals that will be involved in batteries and those sorts of things. So we have an economic interest in Canada, in Africa for Canadians, but we also have other interests. We're an aging population in Canada, you and me excluded. Others are aging, and the whole demographic of Canada is changing. Africa is a young population. Canada, to continue our way of life, needs markets that are new. Yes, we have great free trade agreements with the United States and Mexico. We have a European agreement. We have the CPTPP. We're expanding Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, Africa is the fastest growing part of the world. They have skills and talents and energies. Canada has an interest in creating markets, creating a middle class in Africa, creating energy independence in Africa cleanly, so that Africa doesn't go through the same mistakes we went through. Our companies can prosper in Africa while creating a greener Africa. That's both in the north, in the Sahel, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, where climate change is real. Africa can feed itself. I am absolutely committed to the fact that Africa can feed itself if we help them with the technologies in agri-food, if we help them not simply grow roses for our markets, but to grow the kinds of foods and have a nutritional sense that will feed their continent, and then they can feed the world. So Canada wants Africa's own engagement with itself. So we are supporting a Pan-African free trade area. We're helping them with the logistics of that. We're funding that work to make sure that that free trade zone is effective and helpful for the whole of the continent. Helping them emerge, not just bump from crisis to crisis to crisis, but to take those next steps over these, Africa 2060, to say we work with the African Union. We've now a full-time representative at the AU in Addis Ababa. That is going to help us engage at a continental level, working with the different regional groups and with some key partners. We may have different relationships with different countries. There's 54 countries in Africa, and we will have a relationship with some of those lionesses of Africa, the big economies, whether it's South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt, but also Kenya, Ghana, and places where they want prosperity, and they've asked for Canada's help, like Botswana or Rwanda. We've opened an embassy in Rwanda now. We used to have a little mission there. We need to have a larger diplomatic footprint in Africa. We're being eclipsed by Russia and China and Turkey. I was in one country recently when I was looking at their parliament building, which was obviously built by China. And, China is there in the long game. And the vice president said to me, well, if you go to the buffet and all the food is Chinese and you're hungry, you're going to eat it. So he said, we want more Canada here. And I'm not wanting to be competitive with Russia and China. They'll have their own game, but Canada needs to be there for Canada's interests, which are economic, but also about we believe that countries that are open, respectful of human rights, and have good, strong institutions will do better. And so that's why we need to be in Africa. So more coming. The framework is still being developed, and is being developed with Africans, so that there will be no surprises. My goal on that strategy, that framework, is no surprises for Africa. They will see themselves in it, and they'll say, Canada has listened. So it takes a little bit longer. If I wanted to just write one and give it to Africa, it'd be very fast. If you listen to the different African voices, it takes a little longer.
Well, as an African scholar, I'm delighted to hear that. I'd like to finish with a question on multilateralism, which you touched on, Dr. Janice Stein touched on beforehand. But the truth is, we have been left out of some discussions recently. And we do bring things to the table. And you mentioned the power of convening etc. I think sometimes the power for convening to the highest common outcome rather than the lowest acceptable output. Could you, if you were to gaze into a crystal ball and say you would wish for Canada's predictability to be known as bringing this to the table, what would it be? And if, you know, policy and strategy is all about drilling down and making bold choices, not being able to do everything, but drilling down and saying, okay, we're going to do these 3 things over the next 5 years, and that'll set us up well for another set of priorities which follow. Could you share some personal insights into where you feel Canada can be more predictable? And based on that predictability, what we will be invited to the clubs based on?
I think Canada is known as being benevolent. We're known as being charitable. We're known as being present. We've also become a little bit known to be preachy. And as a former preacher, I'm very aware of using the word that way. What we have not done a good job at is moving beyond talking about the importance of human rights, the importance of inclusion, the importance of women's rights, the importance of LGBTQ rights, to say that those are necessary and important steps towards prosperity, towards a better life for the citizens of each of those countries that we would want to be preachy in. So it's not enough to say you should promote women's rights, or you should promote gay rights, or you should promote these rights. It's to show other countries that that sort of inclusion is a foundational step towards a better life for the people of the country. And I think we've been missing a step there. I think we're seen, and I'm a biblical person, as a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. We're seen as just talking about those things. We have to get real about them, and to say that, and I've even been told by one head of government, well, you know, we know your Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We need to build education, healthcare, and jobs and housing. And I said, you can't wait for human rights to happen after those are done. They're lockstep with them. That you build a prosperous economy by having a full and inclusive labor force. You invite women into the labor force as they're able and want to be there. You invite those, you take the energy away from suppressing your people into allowing them to emerge as full individuals and human beings. That doesn't mean we have any less commitment to human rights. We keep our commitment, but we allow those countries to see them as their vehicle to having better lives. And that's where I think we've been, it's a lot of blah, blah. And we have to find a better way of expressing that. And we show it too through engagement, not just as a prize once people have acceded to our human rights agenda, but as encouragement and incentivizing it. And we can do that with our like-mindeds as well. So that's where we bring in multilateralism, to say with our key like-mindeds, like especially Northern European countries, where we work really easily with Sweden and Denmark and Norway and other Northern European countries, Germany, the EU, with the United States in most places. We tell them, how do we make sure that those incentives work and that countries see themselves, they feel heard, valued for their unique identities, but also their people feel better in the long run. So that, you know, unemployment rates in Africa are sometimes 50, 60, 70%, not just in the formal economy, but also even in the informal economy. And we want them to have jobs. We want them to have livelihoods. We want them to have prosperity. The way we do that isn't just through, you know, woke Canadian thoughts, but we actually do it by incentivizing and rewarding and encouraging in better ways. That would be my agenda. Maybe that's, I'm speaking as Rob right there, but that would be what I'd be pushing on my own government to do.
Well, I think that we're very lucky as a country to have Rob's voice out there. So I know I'm speaking on behalf of the IPD, Honorable Rob Oliphant, when I say thank you so much. It's been a privilege and honor to hear you speak today. Your thoughts were very insightful and so eloquently presented. So thank you very much. I will now hand the baton back to Zachary.
Well, thank you so much, Anne and Rob. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. I hope we'll see you in person again soon. And it is now my...
I'm going to try to watch here and there because I'm learning a lot.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. I hope we'll have you on our platform again before long.
Thanks.
It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to the moderator of our next session, Walter Kemp, who is our other project co-chair in addition to Anne. You are also the Director for Global Strategy of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today to introduce the next session, which will delve into the question of great power competition and its impact on Canadian interests. Allow me just to remind the rest of our audience before that session begins that we do have two more sessions later today. We're going to be having a session at 1 p.m. That is going to be focusing on the question of multilateralism in Canadian interests. So please do register for that. That will be on a separate Zoom link from this one. So you can go onto our website at peacediplomacy.org and register for that. That discussion will be held exclusively in French. And then we're going to have a final session later today to conclude with a conservative perspective on Canada's national interests, as well as the discussion of values later in the afternoon. So please do register for each of those two sessions. It is two separate Zoom links for those. Walter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Zach, and congratulations on this initiative and this discussion today. It's encouraging to see how many people are out there, consistently around 140 listeners and participants, and where possible, I will be trying to draw on your questions in the chat. We have 90 minutes for this session. It seems like a lot of time, but this is a big topic. The new great power competition, what are Canada's interests? And unfortunately, one of our speakers wasn't feeling very well today, Vina Najibullah, but we do have a great panel, 4 speakers. The Honorable Jean Charest, former Premier of Quebec and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, who I'm sure you all know very well. Andrew Latham, Senior Fellow at IPD and Professor at Macalester College. Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow and Director, Natural Resources, Energy and the Environment at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Adam Chapnick, who's Professor of Defense Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston. As possible, although it's a little bit difficult in this format, I'd like to run this panel as a discussion, but I do want to start by asking Jean Charest to reflect a little bit on the 2 previous speakers and to help us flesh out this idea of what Canada's national interests are. We've heard already the first two speakers talking about the geopolitical environment, the rivalry between the United States and China, conflict between Russia and the West, the rise of the BRICS, perhaps with a question mark, the increase in the number of illiberal governments around the world, shifting alliances in the Middle East, geopolitical tensions playing out in Africa, as well as domestic issues, foreign interference in domestic politics, and the list goes on and on. So, Monsieur Charest, just to get us started, could you actually define what these interests are? You might have heard Janice Stein. She was saying our goal has to actually be to defend these interests. But if people, including Canadians, don't define them, then our role in the world and our profile is not very clear. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Walter, and thank you very much to the Institute of Peace and Development for inviting me. And I'm also delighted to share this platform with Andrew Latham and Heather Exner-Pirot and Adam Chapnick. I have had an opportunity to either read or hear them in different circumstances, and as always, I've been very impressed. The topic you've chosen today, just by the virtue of the short list that you put out there, is a big piece to chew on for us, but extremely timely for Canada, and a very important. We're at a very important moment in our national life where we need to reflect on these issues and get a sense of where we're going. The timing also is interesting in regards to the G20 that was just held in India. And by the way, by the adherence now, the African Union to the G20, which speaks to some of the concerns of Rob Oliphant about the place of Africa in this whole discussion. I listened very, as I always do, very attentively to Janice Stein, who I thought gave us a very good éclairage, a very good sense of where we need to distinguish between different concepts as we look ahead. Yes, there is, as the BRICS has demonstrated, an issue relative to the international rules-based order, which is contested and has been historically dominated by the United States since the Second World War. That distinction and a liberals international rules-based order to which Canada is an adherent. I think that distinction that she presented from the outset is extremely important for the rest of our discussion today. And in fact, it reminded me of a very interesting piece written by Jocelyn Coulon recently in Le Journal La Presse after the BRICS meeting, who very pointedly made that point, saying it's not just about trade and the economy. These are countries that are pushing back on a liberal rules-based order, and that have just included and adhered to the BRICS has just expanded to countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Ethiopia, Iran. And so it's important to understand what it is exactly that is happening in this general context. And I thought Jocelyn expressed it very well. And the distinction that Janice draws is also very important for us. I was also delighted to hear the Honorable Rob Oliphant talk so knowledgeably about Africa, because I do think that for Canada, this is something that is a blind spot. And I was impressed that Mr. Oliphant would be very forthcoming in saying how Canada has not been as present in Africa as we should be, when in fact, our presence there not only is something that the African countries would like, and I know something about that in French Africa, for example, West Africa, but we are very much needed in respect to an environment where French leadership and American leadership is now being contested, and where there's a stronger presence of China and Russia and Turkey, as you mentioned. Now, a word about Canada before I go on to my remarks, just to remind everyone that we're a middle power, very much so. It's been mentioned a few times. We're part of 20 organizations, summits, and forums. We're part of almost every club. Of course, our relationship is greatly defined by our geography, as it is in all international relations. Napoleon, the famous quote of Napoleon comes to mind. In the case of Canada, how true this is. I mean, and we're lucky in a great respect to be next to the United States, who are friends and allies of ours and our most important trading partner. But we're also, the reverse side of the coin is that we're also, very dependent on American leadership and on their economy. Whoever, there was a parliamentarian, I think he was with the Social Credit Party, who said, this was several years ago, where the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not, which sort of exemplifies the ambiguity of our feelings sometimes towards our Americans. We're also part of an extensive trade network throughout the world, 15 trade agreements, and covering 52 countries, which is extremely important for us because we're one of the most trade-dependent countries in the world. 60% of our GDP, if you round out imports and exports, are there. So Canada has a vested interest in having an open trading system. We have a knowledge-based economy. We're the second largest country in the world, and with an extensive Arctic region that neighbors Russia. And now a new light has been shed on the critical importance of this region, not only because of the conflict with Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but also because of the strategic minerals, the oil and gas and other resources that are in the north, and the issue of climate change that affects it dramatically. And one of the features of Canada that I think was spoken to because of the diaspora concept is that, just in Toronto, almost 50% of the population of the greater Toronto area, it's 46.6%, are not born in Canada. We have a large diaspora. By the way, it works fairly well. And you know, it's not as though I am a visible minority in Toronto, to put it in another way. I feel very comfortable about that. It's not something that is anything else but very positive. So when we look at who we are, you know, a country that has a knowledge-based economy founded by the French, the British, and First Nations. We support multilateralism and a rule-based order, of course. And we have an aging population, 2 official languages, and this defines in good part who we are. I want to return to something to our listenership, to people listening today. I want to read 2 quotes that go back 7 years, but which I think were very much defined what is happening today. And the first one is after President Trump had made his first foreign trip abroad. It was to Saudi Arabia in 2017. Following that trip, 2 of his collaborators, Mr. Gary Kahn, who was his advisor on the economy, and McMaster on national security, wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal. This was on the 1st of June, 2017, in which they said this, and I want to read it to you because it is, in my mind, it speaks loudly about what has changed in this world. And they went on to say this: the president embarked on this first foreign trip with a clear-eyed outlook that the world is not a global community, but an arena. The word arena, by the way, is very significant as a choice of word, where nations or non-governmental actors and businesses engage and compete for an advantage. We bring to this forum unmatched military, political, economic, cultural, and moral strength. And rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we embrace it. This was Trump 7 years ago. Only 6 days later, in the House of Commons, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, delivered a foreign policy speech, and which I think rings true today, in which she says this: the fact that our friend and ally has called to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course. For Canada, that course must be the renewal, indeed the strengthening, of the post-war multilateral order. We will robustly support the rules-based international order and all its institutions and seek ways to strengthen and improve them. We will seek leadership in all these: NATO, G7, G20, l'OIF, the Commonwealth, UN multilateral forums. Now, this was 7 years ago, and since then the Biden administration has been elected, and they have taken up the mantle of American leadership in different parts of the world, including the war and the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. And thankfully so, because Europe has certainly benefited a great deal from that American leadership, and Canada has joined in a way that is very significant. But nonetheless, if you look to the future, and you look to where the state of mind was of the American president in 2017, you can't help but think the world has changed dramatically for Canada. Their American neighbor is not the reliable ally it was only a short while ago. And in fact, you can maybe track it back to the Obama administration and the relative indifference of the Obama administration to a certain number of bilateral issues. Keystone comes to mind. Canada has now a new dynamic, a new set of circumstances in which it must make a decision. And I want to return to the core of the discussion here of what we need to decide. And Janice Stein alluded to it. She said something, and I think it's more nuanced. Canada on foreign policy is more a taker than someone who makes policy. Well, we have to decide whether we are going to be uniquely takers or whether or not we are going to lead and make policy. And if we are, then we have to choose in which areas we are going to do that. But I want to set out one of the conditions to do that, which Rob Oliphant referred to in regards to Africa. We need to show up in parts of the world where we have just simply been absent. Because the response would be, why have we been absent? Well, because the Americans have sucked up all the oxygen in the room and renegotiating the USMCA with the old NAFTA. They have consumed all our attention and time. Well, that's not good enough as an answer. Whether it is Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Canada needs to demonstrate more consistency and more of a presence in all parts of the world. And that includes the Indo-Pacific. The recent Indo-Pacific strategy speaks to that, and it's a very positive development. But Canada and Africa, for example, needs to defend what would be defined as our vital trade interest. In Western Africa, it's Canadian mining companies whose viability are threatened by Al-Qaeda, and instability. We have a role to play in these parts of the world. So what are our vital interests? And I know our time is going to be limited, and you wanted me to open up a bit, but trade is certainly a major issue. And we formed the Ottawa group after the questioning of the future of the World Trade Organization that transformed itself into a grouping within the WTO of countries who have now reestablished an appellate mechanism. So we've been able to do that. We have been active on the trade side with CPTPP, with CETA. When CETA was proposed, and I was involved in that, when we did it by saying to the Europeans, if you want to do a trade agreement with the United States, it would be in your vested interest to do one with Canada first. So there are areas on trade, on military support, but we need to do it in a way in which we also say to Canadians, and I'll finish on that, how do we engage? The tricky part is for Canadians to figure out in their mind, how does a country like Canada that defends human rights engage with a country like China? Well, I'll offer you what I think is part of the answer is we need to distinguish between the people of China and the Communist Party of China. Do we engage, or should we engage or not? Obviously, for I believe the answer is we need and we should and we must engage. But for the Canadian public to understand the sense of what we're doing, either on trade with China or on other areas of cooperation in the area of climate, in the area of health, we need to distinguish between the people of China and the Communist Party of China, and bring to that perspective a long-term interest and presence. So I'll stop there, Walter. I mean, there's a lot for us to discuss today, and I look forward to engaging with other panel members.
Thanks very much, and thanks for breaking the ice and putting so many ideas on the table. Adam, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Jean, I wanted to ask you, today is September 11th, and that event was 22 years ago, although it seems like yesterday. At the same time, you've said that so many things have changed in the past few years, certainly in the last 22 years. The last time we had a serious foreign policy review was, I think, around 2001, 2002. How do you explain the fact that the world has changed so considerably, and yet the Canadian government in those last 2 decades has not come out with a new foreign policy review?
Well, it's difficult. I think it's difficult to understand why. I'm among those who believe there should and there needs to be a foreign policy review. You point to one event that dramatically changed our relationship with the United States. I want to remind listeners what Paul Cellucci, who's now passed away, the American ambassador of the United States, said after 9/11. He said, from now on, security trumps trade in the relationship with the United States. And that was a very, very important shift in how our relationship with the United States would then be dealt with. Those are examples of things that have happened. We've had a world recession, the Great Recession in 2008. Climate change since then has now become the ascendant and the overarching issue that dominates everything we do economically, with new industrial policies, with the energy transition. We've had COVID, and we've had the war in Ukraine. And if you look at the bigger picture, then why is it that we haven't? I'm a bit at loss to tell you why. I think maybe there is a lack of consensus or engagement by the federal governments that have been in power since then with their oppositions to try to make a joint effort of defining what our foreign policy should be. And traditionally, foreign policy has not been the object of a lot of partisan divide. Frankly, neither should it be. There should be an honest, very real effort to make it as consensual as possible within our British parliamentary system, and that effort has not been done. And the governments of Canada have let themselves be consumed by whatever was the issue or the urgency of the day. But now the time has come for us to sit down and to have a major review of both foreign and defense policy. For example, with a very strong perspective on the North. And I just want to leave a very intriguing thought for you as we do that. As we look to the North, remember, our American neighbor does not recognize the Northwest Passage as being Canadian territory. The last time they spoke to that, it was Mike Pompeo in a speech he delivered in 2019 in Finland. And he goes out of his way in the text of the speech. I mean, you can see him curve into that issue to say, I want to make a point here that this is not Canadian territory, it's an international passage. It gives you an idea how important this is for us. But these are all parts of the new issues that Canada needs to urgently address, given the more recent events in the world, so that we are better defend our own issues and not always be takers, but also be leaders, as we can be on chosen issues where we can lead.
Thanks. And for those of you who are joining us, one of the reasons behind this Canada's interest in a shifting order project was the frustration that many of us in the research community had with the lack of a recent foreign policy review, which is why we thought we would go from the bottom up, and we'll be coming out with a report relatively soon. Adam, moving over to you. Canada has close historical, geographical, or trade relations with all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And as Jean mentioned, we have a stake in a stable order, a rules-based international system, but we don't have a lot of leverage. If we're going to be givers and not just takers, what can we actually bring to the table?
Thanks very much for the question, Walter, and thanks for having me in this discussion. I'm going to contest the idea a little bit that we always have to be some sort of leaders. I think we have to be available, but I think that there's being available for others to tell us where they might need our leadership, instead of presuming that a country of 40 million, less than 1/2 of the world's population, with an economy 1/13 the size of the United States, to assume that we can step up there on the world stage and tell folks where we're going to lead. I think that's a little presumptuous. I don't think it's particularly helpful. On the other hand, being available, having an economy that enables us to contribute, when the fact that we aren't a great power makes us a more helpful ally, the fact that we are so well connected around the world makes us someone that can speak to other states, that can in fact convene groups that wouldn't convene if the key convener was someone else. I think that's where we can be a little bit more helpful. So I'm coming to that idea that I think we should approach this with more humility. I think that having a foreign policy that establishes that we are connected around the world is extremely important. I agree with Rob Oliphant about the need to be present in more places. I agree with Janice Stein and with Jean Charest about the idea that we need a liberal, rules-based international economic order, no doubt. Liberal, rules-based international economic order, because our national interest in economic prosperity depends on free and fair trade based on the Western liberal tradition. So we absolutely need that. And there I think we've actually been quite successful. Our trade negotiators are among the best in the world. Taking things further, however, I think we need to be more humble. There are real limits to what Canada can do. And if I come back to another point Mr. Oliphant made through a different lens, for us to be preaching on human rights based on the logical argument that a more tolerant, egalitarian society that believes in human rights and the rule of law is consistent with a more economically prosperous one. And I believe that to be true. However, when your national productivity record is as abysmal as ours, we have no business preaching to other countries that they could lower their productivity rates to ours by embracing greater openness and freedoms. So by all means, we should keep doing what we're doing, but I think we need to be a little bit more humble about telling other folks how to do their business.
But Adam, the point was made that we need to step up. We have to show up. And you use the line to be available, but that implies we're kind of on standby with a lot of resources. You also say that we're a country of 40 million people. Our resources in terms of people, but also money, are relatively limited. So we can't be everywhere all at once. And yet John was saying, we need to be in Africa, we need to be in the Middle East. In order to figure out where we can be available, we need to set some priorities, which gets back to the issue of what are our national interests.
I think that it is not as expensive to be present diplomatically around the world as it is to be present militarily around the world. And as a result, you can actually expand your diplomatic footprint first, reestablish all those relationships that we have let wither over the last 30 or so years, and create the flexibility to pivot when needed by our allies to those places where things need to be beefed up. I actually think you can do it because diplomacy is a far more cost-effective form of international engagement than virtually any other. So to me, it is possible, and our interests are, I don't think we can define our interests without considering the interests of our liberal democratic allies who we need for a liberal democratic economic order. I don't think we have distinct national interests that are so unique from our allies that we need to be doing a whole bunch of things that no one else would think of doing as well. I think we suffer in Canada quite often from a quasi-disease. I'll compare it to, I'm going to use a sports analogy, Toronto Raptors. All of a sudden, a few years ago, they become an extremely good basketball team, and there are Canadians upset when they aren't featured on the NBA game of the week. From my mind, who cares? The goal is to win the NBA championship. It doesn't matter how many times you're on television. It doesn't matter how many countries, how many watchers are saying great things about you. Your goal is to win the championship. We don't need to be seen as world leaders. We need a world order that is consistent with our interests. Sometimes that will mean leading. Sometimes it will mean taking. We need to preserve the flexibility to respond to the challenges facing us instead of sacrificing our flexibility by establishing elements of leadership that may or may not be consistent with our long-term interests.
All right, I'm going to come back to you on Ukraine in a moment, but I want to move to Heather. Heather, the topic of this panel is the new great power competition, and a number of speakers have referred to Canada as a medium-sized power or a middle power. But when it comes to energy, we are actually a great power. How does Canada play in that arena, often with countries that are not liberal democracies?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking the question. You knew I'd want to answer it. And to challenge Adam a little bit. And I think exactly that. Yes, we're 4 billion people, but we have the second largest country in the world. And the beauty of that is that we need so little of what we produce, we can export most of it. Whereas China and the United States will also be huge resource superpowers and have a ton of energy and minerals. They need almost all of it for themselves. So that gives us a real, I always like to say, we've been dealt, a full house. We're just waiting to play our cards. When are we going to start playing our cards? I can hardly think of another country in the world, liberal or non, that uses their commodities less strategically, their energy less strategically than Canada does. And in many ways, we have really just devolved. We become a colony of the United States when it comes to energy. 96% of our oil exports goes to the United States. 99% of our gas exports go to the United States. Instead of using it strategically, again, to advance our values and our interests with allies and would-be allies around the world. We're letting Germany negotiate long-term deals with Qatar and Oman instead of giving them LNG. We have this incredible arable land. Food security is going to be increasingly a growing problem. We export most of the grains that we produce. We don't need, there's 1 million people in Saskatchewan. They don't need all the grain and all the oil seeds and all the pulses that they produce. So we have this, we've been dealt, again, this incredible card. We have not been strategic with it at all. But as we move from what's been a commodities down cycle to a commodities super cycle, again, I think this will become more important. We all know everyone's trying to get off dependence on Russian gas, Russian resources, Chinese resources. China is the world's largest miner, in addition to having monopolies on processing. And obviously our allies are looking to Canada to fill some of that void. And the beauty is we still have those oil reserves. We still have those gas reserves. We still have all that untapped critical minerals, whereas a lot of other countries have been going through their best reserves and their best deposits. So there's Canada is so lucky that we actually have good options on the table. We actually still have cards that we can play as we go into, kind of emerge out of this crisis. I remember Jean Charest mentioned after 9/11, we said that we needed to focus on security as part of trade. And I don't know that happened, but I think after the Ukraine invasion of Ukraine, that is happening, where the security aspect is starting to trump the free trade globalization aspect. And in those circumstances, Canada can actually benefit. So yeah, again, we have been, I think, complacent. We've had, we are so energy secure in Canada that we take for granted that others are energy and food secure. They're not. There'll be growing calls for us to step up. And the great thing is we actually have the potential to do so.
Thanks, Heather. I'll come back to you to drill a bit deeper into that topic, but I want to move to Andrew. A number of speakers have said that the world wants more Canada. I hear from Heather that there's enough Canada to go around for plenty of the world. We've been talking about the great powers, the members of the Security Council, but there are other actors in the world, the European Union, the BRICS that has been referred to. Where does Canada stand with other middle powers, and how can we strengthen our profile in the world and have a bit more, I'd say, bang for the buck? That Heather's pointed out, we have these resources. In the past, we've been thought leaders on different issues. Think about the International Criminal Court, responsibility to protect, human security. We haven't heard those big ideas lately or anything like it. So how do we get back onto the world stage? Remember when the Trudeau government came in and said, Canada's back. Canada's not that well received in many parts of the world.
Well, Canada's not back. And so let me both agree with certain previous speakers and disagree and adopt a kind of a radical realist perspective on where Canada is in the world today. We have core interests. They are persistent. They are the same interests almost that every other country in the world has. Let me just enumerate them: security, sovereignty, territorial integrity. In Canada's case, freedom, a liberal democratic political order, and of course, prosperity. Canadians expect a certain level, a certain standard of living. And that for us, to be really just radical, going to the roots, depends on access to economic access to certain regions of the world. The Indo-Pacific of growing importance, Europe of historical importance, North America, our relationship with the United States, it's beyond debate. And increasingly the Arctic, which intersects and overlaps with North America and Europe, but as a region in and of itself, is increasingly important. And then in a minor note, but not insignificant, Africa and Latin America in terms of access to critical minerals and rare earth elements. Peru, something like 85% of the world's copper comes from Peru, cobalt from the Congo, et cetera, et cetera. So that's important as well in terms of the next generation of economic development. What are the threats to those interests? So Canada has an interest in open and free access to those regions in terms of its prosperity, but also in some of those regions in terms of its security. The emergence of a hostile hegemon in any of those regions is not in Canada's interests, because it has the potential to preclude or obviate or otherwise obstruct Canadian access to those economic and security goods. So we have an interest in preventing that, as does the United States, by the way, and in this respect, we're not all that different. But the big strategic question for Canada is, where can and should we actually devote always scarce resources to precluding, preempting, or preventing the emergence of a hostile hegemon in any of these regions? And here's where some very profound changes in the global political order matter. The space within which Canada has pursued its middle power politics, its middle power strategy forever, is shrinking. We are moving from a unipolar moment. I don't want to get into all of the details because they're boring. But we're moving beyond that into a world in which regions matter. And authentic membership in regions really matter in terms of Canada's ability to shape the international environment. This will shock Canadians in the spirit of Janice Grostein's comments a little bit earlier. We are not authentic members of the region that we call Europe. We are not, despite whatever posturing the current government might undertake, we are not authentic members of the Indo-Pacific region in the same way that India or Indonesia or Australia are authentic members. We are simply not. So if I'm asking myself where we should devote always scarce resources to ensuring or promoting or advancing or defending Canadian national interests as I've defined them, it really boils down to this. We are authentic members of two regions. North America will always be a junior partner, there's no debate there, and the Arctic. And we have a vested interest in making sure that the Arctic is not dominated by, say, Russia, or, I have to say, increasingly China, which has declared itself a near Arctic country and which is really doubling down on trying to shape and affect the Arctic region. Canada can't be a free rider. That doesn't serve our interest in any understanding of that term. Where we can invest our scarce, always scarce resources, diplomatic, military, et cetera, is in the Arctic and North America. NORAD, obviously, the access to North America on the Northern Pacific side and the North Atlantic side, and also in the Arctic. So that's my take on where we should be devoting our resources, North America and the Arctic. And despite the, I'm going to use a provocative term, the delusions of the current government in Canada, we'll never be a major player in the Indo-Pacific, no matter how many of Her Majesty's, His Majesty's now Canadian ships sail through the Strait of Taiwan.
Thanks, Andrew, also for sharpening the focus of our discussion. Jean, I'm going to come to you in a sec to see if you agree or want to challenge those assumptions. But Adam, Andrew used the expression that Canada can't be a free rider, but that's exactly what we've been accused of by some American newspapers, among others, of our role in NATO. How do you see the impact of the war in Ukraine on Canada's role as a North Atlantic partner? Andrew makes the point that we're not in a position to shape events in Europe. Should we still be sending troops to Latvia then? And is it fair to call us a free rider?
I think that the Canadian approach to NATO historically has always been pretty close to the same, with perhaps some exceptions in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it's characterized by a term that a professor named Joel Sokolsky said was, how much is just enough? We do just enough to keep our allies satisfied that we are contributing sufficiently to keep our seat at the table, not at the front of the table, but in the room, so we're aware of what is going on. I think that the calibration on just enough is a little bit out of whack right now. And as a result, we're taking more criticism for a lack of investment. But I don't think anyone should assume that we'll ever do much more than just enough in support of NATO or any other international organization that involves defense. Prime Minister basically said as much, although it would have been nice if it didn't come out. And historically, the United States has always complained that we are riding too freely. I mean, this is not a new thing in any way, shape, or form. Americans have been complaining about Canada's contribution to NATO basically since there's been a NATO. So it does not disturb me nearly as much, but I do concede that the calibration seems to be a little bit off right now. And as a result, although there seems to be a will in the government to do more in in Europe for Ukraine. We don't seem to have the means to do so because we have allowed some of our defense capabilities to atrophy so greatly in the last number of years.
Thanks, Adam. Jean, over to you. You've heard what Andrew said. If I can summarize, kind of pure realpolitik, we can't shape events in Europe, we can't shape events in Indo-Asia region, we can't shape events in Africa. He didn't say it, but basically we can't shape events in North America south of the border. Therefore, the one place where we can make a difference that is inherent to our national interests and our national security is in the Arctic. So it's our true north, strong and free. How do we keep it that way? And do you share that view?
Well, with some nuances. First of all, I do agree with Andrew that if we had to prioritize, set priorities, the North should rank among the first. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. And we've known for a while that climate change, for example, is changing radically the northern environment in ways that we had not anticipated only a few years ago. Opening up new trade routes, for example. Let's talk of the reality of that. There's the northern route controlled by the Russia that is now being militarized. They had said they would not militarize that. They are. And then there's the Northwest Passage that belongs to Canada, but that our American neighbor doesn't recognize. Watch for China to take advantage of the Americans' policy position on the Northwest Passage to say, well, fine. In fact, they floated a ship in 2017 in that passage with the consent of Canada and with our cooperation. Same year they published their paper on the Arctic Silk Road, 17 pages, I think. And I remember reading it. It had all the key words, all the buzzwords in there that spoke to issues like climate. So yes, the North, very much so. The United States, because it's our political reality, it's our geography. And for example, 2026 is the year where CUSMA comes up for a renegotiation. We have to be careful, Walter, that we not end up like we did the last time, allowing all of that to suck out all the oxygen out of the room of foreign affairs and not do anything else. But let me speak, I do have a nuance. Canada can, if we choose on certain subjects, to make a difference. I'll give you two examples on the environment. The Montreal Protocol in 1987. On CFCs, HCFCs. First protocol to include market-based instruments is as a way to addressing these issues, and the most successful environmental protocol in the world. And then the Clean Air Act, the bilateral agreement with the United States on SO2 emissions, again, with economic instruments in it. Canada was very focused on these matters and was able to lead. Now, I want to give you an example that's under the radar for most Canadians. We, with climate change, are going to have to invest massively in infrastructure in the energy transition. Well, it just happens to be that Canada's pension funds, Walter, are today, if not the first, certainly among the first, investors in infrastructure in the world. And yet our government doesn't seem to seize upon this to say, that as we push ahead and want to deal with issues in Africa, for example, on building infrastructure, much needed infrastructure, and the new proposal in dealing with that is something called blended finance, which includes both private and public sector investment, because there's not going to be enough public money to go around. We're deep into debt. Here is a place. Now, there's a real example where Canada can lead and lead by example. I do agree with one thing, though, to conclude. No one, and this is something I've said to audience when we pushed ahead with the Canada-Europe trade agreement, no one, Walter, in the world gets up in the morning and says to themselves, I wonder what Canada's doing today. And by the way, that's not a knock against Canada. It's just but I know this from experience. If Canada knocks on the door, we are well received because of who we are and what our history is beyond the day-to-day politics. If we choose to advance certain issues and pull ahead, well, we're more than just another player at the table. We can get a great deal done, as we did with the Ottawa Group on trade after the American administration refused to cooperate within the WTO on the appellate mechanism. We put together the Ottawa Group that morphed into the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, which now includes about 50 countries within the WTO. That's a small example of what we can accomplish if we choose to focus on certain issues, recognizing that we can't lead on everything, but we can on issues that count for us.
Jean, just to ping pong your argument back at you, maybe countries don't wake up and say, what's Canada going to do for me today? But with due respect to the Honorable Rob Oliphant, I don't think he's still on the call, but I don't think Canadians wake up and say, I want an international rules-based system today and have a system safe for human rights and the rule of law and multilateralism. I think there has to be a case that our leaders in Canada are making to say, here is a narrow and clear set of foreign policy interests that we have as a country, not least with the Arctic, that is our policy, and from that will follow resources, defense policy, etc. That to me is missing. And only then we keep looking at from the outside in what's going on in the world. We should be looking at from the inside out. What do we need? What are our interests?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it plays to the old saying: leaders lead. And the Canadian public need their leaders to bring forward these ideas, and they'll be contested and debated, but it is for the leaders to put them on the table. We're the ones, or we're those who are in office now, and those who aspire to be, need to advance those ideas and to do that. And it returns to one, I think, sort of conundrum for Canadians, because they instinctively look at China and they say, well, I don't like what's happening in China. But also instinctively, they understand that this is, a superpower. It is a superpower that behaves, by the way, with a superpower. Reminds me on trade, for example, and dealing with Europeans. I remember telling Europeans, remember the unwritten rule when you do a trade deal with the Americans on trade. They reserve themselves the right to interpret the rules. It is called power. And you know what? The Chinese are doing exactly the same thing. They learned it from the Americans, but it is the behavior of a superpower. They have impulses, and we need to learn how to manage that. And that's what Canada, the art of governing in Canada has been. How do you manage your relationship with a neighbor, not just a neighbor, but a superpower? That being said, it is for us, it's incumbent on us to, as leaders and on our leaders, to say, how do we handle the relationship with China and other powers? And that's why I advance the idea that there has to be a clearer distinction in the minds of Canadians between the people of China, for example, and the Communist Party. And here is why we engage with them, and what conditions we do, while respecting and promoting what we believe to be our fundamental interests in defending human rights.
Thanks, Heather. I want to go back to pick up a couple of points. One, Jean's point on the green energy transformation and the potential role for Canada there. The other is the Arctic, not necessarily as a zone of competition, but potentially a zone of cooperation for disaster risk reduction, climate change and security, kind of management of the global commons. It would be great to hear your views on those two issues. And for the rest of you out there, I know there are 130 of you, please, if you have any questions or comments in the chat which relate to this discussion. I know there's some of you who put questions there, they're not necessarily related to this discussion, but please, we do have some time for some Q&A. Heather, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks. And the Arctic is really my main area of expertise. And so to Andrew's point, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this would have been a perfect place for Canada to step up and provide some leadership, that the Arctic is in flux. It does need a new direction. What will it be? How will we make it? And I, of course, follow Arctic news and comments and policy statements very closely. And all the stories will start with, this is what Russia's doing, this is the United States doing. And sometimes they'll say, this is what Norway is doing. And it'll never get to a point where they say, this is what Canada's doing. No one is looking to Canada for leadership on the Arctic, which is a very sad state of things. And given that in the 90s, we were a leader on Arctic policy. We did, the Arctic Council was our idea. We did advance the idea of sustainable development, including Indigenous peoples as permanent participants, and provided that leadership at the time with Joe Clark and then with Lloyd Axworthy. And then for the last 20 years, not a lot, even with, the Harper Conservatives, focused on the Arctic, had a lot to do with the Arctic, but could not convince our Nordic or the, at the time, the Obama administration to follow our lead on that. And then with the Liberals, it's gotten even worse. Just almost an absence of Arctic leadership, where again, no one is looking to us to think what will be the great ideas from Canada coming on how to negotiate the new normal in the Arctic. But to your point of what is happening, the Arctic Council, obviously, it's a consensus-based organization with the 8 Arctic states, and it's now a NATO 7 and Russia. And it cannot exclude Russia because it's a consensus-based organization without Russia's consent. And so there's a real question of how does the Arctic Council continue to function, where obviously at a high political level, we're not going to be inviting Sergei Lavrov, to Ottawa or DC or to Oslo, to talk about permafrost. So I think that there does need to be something else, something different. The Arctic Council cannot continue as it is until some regime change, I will say, happens in Russia, something very different in Russia, certainly not under Putin. It cannot resume the cooperation that it had before. But people should also be assured that there is still some functional cooperation happening. The Arctic Council is very much a political forum. It's not a hard treaty body, but the search and rescue agreement is still, it hasn't been repealed. So that still exists. So all the protocols that we set up in the last few years in the search and rescue agreement we set up are still in force. Nothing has been changed there. On fisheries agreement, there's a Central Arctic Oceans fisheries moratorium. All the state parties met, Russia was included, and negotiated, yes, we'll continue the moratorium for another few years. There are no fish, so it wasn't a tricky negotiation, but the fact is that Russia was involved in that. Norway and Russia still established their fishing quota in the Barents Sea, continued on that. So there is some functional cooperation happening on the scientific and environmental level. But I don't think the West should invite a high-level political negotiation with Russia in the Arctic, given the war crimes that they're committing in Ukraine.
Thanks, Heather. There's a question in the chat. I think you've more or less spoken to it, but from Alexander Landry asking, could Heather please speak to the role of the Arctic 7 moving forward and how Canada might look to continue fostering such dialogue? Can you really talk about the Arctic without Russia?
Well, this is a great question. So people should know, and we always say this is the question: what can we do without Russia in the Arctic? Russia is half the landmass, 2/3 of the people, and 3/4 of the GDP in the Arctic. So it is the great power in the Arctic. That being said, it's often been the A7 and Russia in a lot of things. And the Arctic Council in one respect was about bringing Russia into the fold. There was an Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement in 2017. That was really about you wouldn't need a scientific agreement if Russia wasn't involved. The other ones, you can go to their countries, you can go to Svalbard, you can do Arctic science. So that was about bringing Russia in. But it's always been difficult for Western scientists to go to Russia. So it wasn't Shangri-La before to do all the scientific cooperation with Russia. There was always suspicion. There's data concerns when you're sharing data. And now, I have a lot of Russian colleagues, have co-published with Russians. You can't even communicate with them now because they will be tracked. It's dangerous for your Russian colleagues in many ways to communicate with them. So in as much as we might want to ignore what's happening and compartmentalize the Arctic, Russia is not compartmentalizing the Arctic anymore. So I always say would it be preferable to have an 8 and have all this cooperation? Yes, but Russia has made choices that we have to live with and that we have to respond to. It wasn't our choice, but we had to respond to it. So in my mind, Russia has made the choice. Now we have to move on as an A7. There's lots you can do on Arctic research. Most of our Arctic research money isn't involved in Canadian scientists to Russia. It's involved in sending Canadian scientists to Canada. Satellite monitoring, those kinds of things. There's still most Arctic science research does not involve Russia, did not involve collaboration with Russian scientists. So it's sad to lose, the 10% that did, but the other parts will continue.
Thanks, Heather. Adam, there are 3 great powers that have a significant interest in the Arctic: China, Russia, the United States. If the Arctic was a foreign policy priority, what would that mean in terms of defense policy for Canada?
That's a good question, because what you can do with the Navy and what you can do with the Coast Guard aren't necessarily the same thing. I think where it would have an effect is on NORAD, where I do believe we should be doubling down, based on part of what Andrew has said about the most important relationship we have in the world is with the United States. It will always be. Geography is there. One of the best ways to deal with American concerns about Canadian commitment to defense, a pragmatic way to deal with Canadian national interests based on the inevitability of geography, would be to invest what meager defense funding we have in the Canadian North as a response to the American request to do more for NORAD, as a mention to NATO of we will take care of our neighborhood so you don't have to, based on the pure economic interests in making sure that we have a vital, economically stable and potentially prosperous Arctic. So I think you would see a bit of a shift in that we do more in NORAD as we've promised to, but I would continue to maintain that our ability to be flexible beyond the Arctic remains the value added that we contribute. We have this enormous privilege. We talked about some of the privileges and fortunate situation that Canada has. We have the enormous privilege geographically of living aside a country that shares very similar interests in brute form and security with us. In that context, we have been able to not free ride, but cheap ride for a while, and we should take that dividend and make it available when it is necessary to deal with conflicts around the world. So by all means, an increase in focus of defense on the Arctic through the prism of NORAD makes perfect sense. But I'm less comfortable with an all-out shift, neglecting the fact that we have value added to play by being able to provide when asked in other places.
Thanks, Adam. There's a question in the chat from Louisa Vahedi. Andrew, I'm wondering if you can help me out here. Rob Oliphant made the point earlier about how human security and Canadian national interests are intrinsically linked. I'm hearing from you more of a hard security perspective, that we need to be looking at our core national interests. She asks, could someone speak to the linkage between traditional security and human security? Could this be a way for Canada to frame international dialogue and negotiations in this current era of turning away from human rights? Do human rights still matter for Canadian foreign policy? Sorry, you're on mute, Andrew.
Human rights matter as a matter of values, but not as a matter of core interests. And we have been very good about posturing internationally on the issue of human rights and everything that derives from that. But again, we have scarce resources. Well, first of all, nobody's listening anymore. Two defeated efforts to accede to the Security Council, I think says it all. We can posture and we can make all kinds of posturing moves, but in terms of advancing Canadians' core national interests, I think that moment has passed. Once upon a time, at the height of the liberal international order, to go all the way back to Janice Gross-Stein's comments, this was some leverage that we had. But that moment has passed. Nobody's listening anymore. And we know nobody's listening anymore because nobody wants us to be on the Security Council anymore. So what's the alternative? Not so much posturing and making loud noises about our moral commitments and our values, but about actually pursuing our core national interests. And those are not bad core national interests. We're not looking to, we're not an imperialist power, et cetera, et cetera. All we really want at the end of the day is a world in which we are safe and secure, in which we have access to really important markets. That goes back to prosperity, as I said earlier. And that's what it really boils down to. as I said, once upon a time, at the height of the unipolar moment, the end of history, the liberal international order and all of that, we could posture and preen. It made us feel really good on the international stage. But that moment is past. And now we have to be, like every state in all of human history, really, sensitive to our core national, not our peripheral, secondary, tertiary, but our core national interests, which really do boil down to sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, and freedom for us, and access to those key regions of the world. Just one last thing. It's a hard thing for Canadians who have grown up believing that we are the moral leaders of the world. It's a hard thing to internalize, but that's where we are.
For those of you who are interested in this topic, there's a panel later called What Role for Values Promotion in a Post-Liberal World, and it will address precisely this issue. Jean, are you still out there?
Yes, I am. Wow.
Great. Janice Stein made the point earlier, I don't know if you heard her, but she said it's no big deal that we twice failed at trying to be on the UN Security Council. And yet Andrew and others have made the point that we need to be clear-headed enough to try and shape a world where we're safe. The top table for doing that is the UN Security Council. Why wouldn't we try again in the near future to get that seat? And if you think that's a good idea, how do you think we could go about it differently to increase our chances of success?
Well, Walter, I was part of the second effort, and I acted as a special envoy for Canada and went to the Middle East, parts of Europe, and ASEAN to promote Canada's candidacy for the Security Council. Let me also add that Janice, and I did listen very carefully to what Janice was saying, and as I always do, Janice also said, thank God we didn't win a place on the Security Council. We'd be wasting a lot of time and effort in a forum where that's dysfunctional. And in fact, the Security Council is much more at the center of what we're all talking about as a symbol than meets the eye. Why is the BRICS all of a sudden become flavor of the day? What's important about the BRICS? As Jocelyn Coulon, as I mentioned earlier, pointed out in a paper earlier, the BRICS is a response to the fact that this international rules-based order that the Americans put in place does not now account for the rise of emerging economies, which includes India, which is now the most populous country in the world, soon to be by 2035, I think it'll probably be the third biggest economy in the world after China and the United States, and then it'll be India and Japan. And this whole infrastructure, international diplomacy infrastructure that we have does not take that into account. The basic problem with the Security Council is that the 5 members now on the security, permanent members, have no interest at all, none, in changing the rules and divesting themselves of the veto power that they have. So there's a blocage there. And so now a word though about Canada and its attempt. And you sort of got a sense, frankly, that the Trudeau government was trying to get one over the Harper government that was unsuccessful in doing it. And so we're going to do it and it'll work. Fact of the matter is, it was not, the timing of it was too late. By the time we got into it, and I was there on the ground floor, the other 2 countries had already received commitments. And now what's the bigger perception of Canada in the world, though? Our branding in the world remains very positive, Walter. Let's know it. It's very positive, as it is, as we have, limited perceptions of every country, but Canada is still viewed as very positive. Of course, no one wakes up in the morning saying, well, why don't we do a deal with Canada today? Because that's the nature of life and business. But if we knock on doors and if we are pursuing an idea, an initiative, we can lead if we choose, but we can't choose on everything. We can't do it on everything. It has to be very close to our core interest. And I'll return to an idea we should promote. There's the overarching issue of our time is climate change, and the energy transition affects Canada very differently. Since the war in Ukraine, now the whole issue of security of supply has become a major issue, and a lot of Canadians get it, that it may have been a better idea to do a pipeline than what we thought at the outset, that we would be part of the answer. But as you look ahead, Canada could play a major role in offering the world very practical solutions on blending finance, on the contribution of our Canadian pension funds, who are among the most important contributors of infrastructure in the world, Walter, in the world right now. How many people know that? I get a sense the Canadian government doesn't even know that. These are the instruments and the new tools that we should be working with so that we can, in areas in which we choose, lead and make a difference and not act as, be a fatalist. And what I'm worried about from the sense of this panel is that we're too much of a fatalist right now, saying, well, that's just the way things are, and we'll just have to, assume our place. Let's choose strategically, intelligently where we want to go and lead.
One hypothesis for why we didn't win at least the second time round was that, unlike Norway or Ireland, a lot of countries in different parts of the world said, where have you guys been for the last few years? And the country that more or less invented peacekeeping, we now have 58 blue helmets. Can you imagine 58 Canadians in peacekeeping? That's it. Do you think we should go back into peacekeeping a bit more robustly?
Well, there's two things about that. One is, and it's been raised in this panel, Canada has, it's true, we have been lecturing other countries in certain instances, and with our new trade agenda, there's this sense that we're lecturing, and it's fine to lecture, but if you're going to lecture, Walter, you better have some muscle and resources behind it, because if you're lecturing just to lecture, some of our panelists refer to this, people will stop listening. I mean, period. And Canada has been at fault of doing too much lecturing. Secondly, we've been absent, just absent. And I'll give you an example. I met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Middle East country, who said to me, this is the first time I've met with a Canadian government representative since in the last 5 years. I mean, you just can't, you have to show up. So, but the good news is, if we do choose to show up and to be able to make contributions in specific areas of policy, like building out the infrastructure needed on the energy transition, the role of our pension funds, blended finance, we could very well be in the lead on that. And if we do, then I think there'll be a real opportunity for us to have a stronger presence and a constructive presence in the world for all the right reasons.
Adam, any views on peacekeeping? There was also a question in the chat on how to reduce large groups of people on the move, impending migration crises. Is that something where Canada could actually make a difference on the ground?
Well, I'll start with the peacekeeping, and I make a pragmatic case. If this country, no matter which political party is in charge, is unwilling to invest seriously on defense, then it makes sense for our defense policy to prioritize the interventions that are of most need to our allies. Our allies are asking us to do more in NATO. Sure, it would be nice to do more in UN peacekeeping as well, but if given the choice, our allies, our military allies, would prefer that we do more in NATO. Unless there's a government that says, I want to spend enough to do both, then to me, you continue to prioritize your engagements through NATO. That makes you more valuable in the alliances that are consistent with your interests. On migration, I think we have carved out a small niche as leaders in refugee resettlement, which I think is a very good thing. And it doesn't bother me that Canadians aren't all that aware of it. I'm much more interested in the international community being aware of it and appreciating it than anyone trying to score political points at home by making Canadians feel particularly proud of it. It's another pragmatic move that makes sense based on our desire to have more immigrants anyway. And I think there we are slowly, year by year. If you look at the number of refugees resettled, Canada is in fact leading on that number the last 4 or 5 years consecutively. I think that's a great thing, but I don't see how it's a national interest to go yelling that from the mountains. We can do a good job, establish a reputation, and continue on.
Thanks. I'm going to wrap up with one kind of tour de table on the screen. I'd like to ask each panel member for if they can name a region which they think is Canada's highest priority and a thematic issue. I think I'm already clear, but some of you are going to say, but just to wrap it up, starting with Heather.
Well, I guess I have to say the Arctic, but I do think it's strategic. So what concretely, we could say the Arctic's important. What does that mean in practice? What do we want the policy to look like? And where do we want the spending to be? And I'm much less concerned about sovereignty. No one is looking to take over our lands, and invasion is impossible. No one expects conventional warfare in the Arctic. The real security risk is the hypersonic missiles coming over and attacking southern cities. And you're starting to hear this much more publicly in the United States, not only in editorials in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but in Senate hearings and from community members saying Canada needs to step up in NORAD in the Arctic, because it is a real vulnerability, to fortress North America. So the Americans obviously have their hands very busy on the Pacific with China and very busy on the Atlantic with Russia. And it would sure be a great help if we would just cover our own country and be able to deter and defend, North American Arctic, and let them, spend their money and resources and time on those other areas. So putting money into NORAD to make, a lot of our capabilities are 80s, 90s capabilities. Well, the Chinese and the Russian weapon systems are a little more sophisticated than we can now detect and deter. So putting that money in, it's been committed. No one has much confidence that it'll be deployed quickly and effectively. The money that's been committed is meant to be spent over decades, but the problem is quite urgent now. And of course, the flip side of everything is here's a great opportunity to do some nation building, to build some infrastructure in our Arctic. For the other security aspect of the Arctic, which was mentioned, is to get more of our critical minerals out to market. So we want to have an energy transition. We want to get off the dependence of China and Russia and other authoritarian regimes. The Canadian Arctic is too expensive for any market to develop right now. That's why they're still unexploited. That's why we still have these great deposits, because it is so expensive to develop it because of a lack of infrastructure. So there's an opportunity here to do some dual use, civil militarian technology, innovations, infrastructure, defend that territory, keep North America off limits for any adversary, and also start to, getting more of our resources out to markets to help our allies.
Thanks. So region is the Arctic, and the thematic issues, energy security. Andrew, over to you. I know the region.
Well, let me agree wholeheartedly with Heather on all of that. Doing more in NATO includes doing more in the Arctic and North America. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So let's always scarce resources. We have these national interests. Let's invest in the Arctic and Arctic security, and because these regions overlap, North America, so NORAD as well. If we could pull our own weight in NORAD and the Arctic, I'm thinking NATO would be happy. I'm thinking we would actually be securing our national interests. I'm thinking all would be good.
That sounds clear and promising. Adam?
I don't think I'm that far apart. I'll just use different words. I mean, North America is the priority region to me. It includes the Arctic, so I'm no different there. I think the term I would use thematically is economic security. It's a liberal international economic order that is so critical to our economic prosperity. That is contributed to conveniently if you work on the Arctic and if you work on North America. So it all comes in a package, but I'd frame it as economic security.
Super. Sean, last word to you.
Well, economic security, which includes trade, I think we're on the right track. We're negotiating with ASEAN, we're negotiating with Indonesia. The issue on trade for Canada has always been the same. The governments conclude the trade agreements, but there's no follow-up from business and actually getting into the markets. I would say there's three things, Walter, I would pay attention to. The number one is the inevitable one. If you're a prime minister of Canada, one of the big challenges you have is managing the relationship with the United States. It will always be extremely high on the agenda, and bearing in mind that the United States, again, isn't just a neighbor, it's a superpower. So managing that relationship means managing a relationship with a superpower. And we have Kuzma coming up for negotiations in 2026, which may happen under a Trump administration, by the way. On the Arctic, totally agree. And I think we're all of the same mind. And if we are, only a year ago, what I was proposing is that we have two military bases in the Arctic, one a deep seawater port and another base, and it's urgent. And I think the Arctic is a much bigger issue than even we assume at this point. And it has to do with climate change, for example, but also I would add trade routes. Remember, one of the things that's going to happen as a consequence of climate change is the opening up, which is happening now, of new trade routes between Europe and Asia. And that is going to have a major, major impact on how Canada will have to deal. And it does allow us to do our job within NATO, with our self-interest in mind, and NORAD, as Andrew has pointed out, and access to resources. So that's a big part of it. The third one I'll throw in is something that we haven't talked about today, where Canada is uniquely positioned and doing well, and it's the whole issue of labor mobility, including refugees. We should be the country in the world. And if we are, with all the other countries regressing on these policies because of populism, and the issue of immigration is key. We need people, we need minds, we need talent in this country, and we could be, and we are probably now, but we could be the great leader in the world in terms of figuring out how labor mobility works and recruiting people of talent. The key, though, there, Walter, is this: if you're going to have an immigration policy, the only way it succeeds is if it rhymes with the word integration. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a lot of political problems. Housing being an example of that right now. But Canada has an opportunity to be a leader in its own self-interest in this regard, and that is something that the rest of the world will look at in terms of how do you get it right on labor mobility in a world where this is more and more the norm than it's been in the past. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and to the colleagues on the panel. They've all been very interesting and enlightening. I've learned a lot. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you very much, and also for your last answer, because it addresses a point that was made in the chat, not least about labor mobility and integration. Super panel. Jean, I don't want you to leave with the impression that we're somehow pessimistic. I think this was a rather realpolitik discussion where I was surprised at the relative like-mindedness of our conclusion about the need for focus on the Arctic and economic security and energy security. I think we've not jettisoned the idea of values, but we've also put that in balance with interests and how it's actually in our enlightened self-interest to work with other countries. This is not fuzzy liberalism. This is, enlightened self-interest. So really good discussion. Thanks very much as well to those of you who've put some questions and comments in the chat. Zach, are you out there? You want to make an announcement on the next panel? I forgot to thank the panelists. Thank you very much for taking the time and for all your inputs. And we will certainly be following up.
You beat me to it, Walter. I was simply going to thank the panelists as well. This was indeed a fantastic discussion, wonderful as well to see, despite the vigorous debate, that there's still like-mindedness on the nature of and scope of Canada's national interests in this shifting international order. Part of what our project here at IPD has tried to do is indeed to identify those commonalities, despite the increasing level and degree of partisanship in Canada and the increasing polarization of the political spectrum. Sometimes we do end up with significantly different understandings of how Canada should be engaging with the world and with different regions of the world and on different topics. And yet, having parsed through this discussion for 90 minutes today, it looks as if we've really managed to reach, to get down to the core. So thank you again for all of our panelists joining us today. Just a reminder to everyone that you can sign up for our afternoon sessions starting at 1 and then 2:30 p.m. respectively. The links have been shared in the chat. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde d'être avec nous aujourd'hui et à la prochaine.
Merci, gars.
Merci. À la prochaine. Au revoir.
À la prochaine.